For 5 years, a former Navy SEAL fostered 37 rescue dogs and gave every one of them away. He was good at saving them, but terrible at letting himself need them. So he made a rule and lived by it. Heal them, train them, let them go. Then came the 38, a 7-week-old German Shepherd puppy who seemed to dislike everything about him: his house, his voice, even the warm bed waiting by the stove. So when a kind family opened their door, the SEAL told himself the puppy had found what every rescue dog deserved: a real home. But a week later, the puppy was back on his porch. Another family took him in, farther away this time. Still, the puppy found his way back. Only then did the SEAL realize the puppy had not been running from anyone. He had been trying to bring someone home. Before we begin, tell us what city you're watching from today. We'd love to know how far this story travels. Silas Keene lived at the far end of Quarry Road, where the pavement narrowed past the last row of mailboxes, and the hills began to fold into the soft, uneven country outside Decorah. In April, that part of Iowa never seemed to keep one face for long. Morning light could lie pale across an old barn roof, noon could bring a thin rain against the kitchen glass, and by late afternoon a cold breath from the upper Iowa River might slip through the maples along the ditch. By evening, the whole road smelled of wet soil, young grass, and wood smoke from houses where people still believed spring needed to be negotiated. Silas liked that kind of weather. It asked for nothing straight. His house sat back from the road behind a low fence he had built himself, plank by plank, after the first foster dog learned how to squeeze through the old one. There were towels hanging from a line beside the back steps, a stack of dented food bowls near the mudroom, and a row of hooks where leashes hung in quiet order. Anyone passing slowly enough could tell dogs came through that house often, though never long enough to make the place look settled around them. People in town knew pieces of him, which made them think they knew the man. They knew he had been a Navy SEAL. They knew he had worked with canines overseas. They knew he came home with his hair cropped close, his shoulders still carrying the old discipline of command, and a way of standing near exits without seeming aware of it. They knew he bought dog food in bulk, paid cash when he could, and rarely spoke more than a sentence or two at the grocery store. That was enough for most of them to build a version of him. At the diner near the square, he was called quiet. At the hardware store, he was called serious. At Sunday lunch tables, where kindness sometimes wore the thin coat of curiosity, he was called that man out on Quarry Road, as if the road itself explained everything strange about him. Nobody said these things with real cruelty, at least not at first, but small towns had a way of polishing a judgment until it looked like common sense. Preston Vale polished his better than most. Preston owned the insurance office near the courthouse, a narrow brick building with clean windows, a brass bell on the door, and framed photos of charity breakfasts lined along the wall. He was also president of the town business association, which meant he shook hands at fundraisers, introduced guest speakers at the community hall, and used the phrase civic responsibility as if it had been handed down to him on a silver tray. He wore good coats, kept his shoes bright even in muddy weather, and smiled in a way that made people feel included until they realized someone else had been left outside the circle. Silas was often the person outside it. Preston never insulted him directly. That would have been too crude, and Preston valued polish more than honesty. Instead, he made remarks over coffee about how neighborhoods needed standards, how good intentions could become a nuisance, how no one wanted Quarry Road turning into a testing ground for troubled dogs. He would say it lightly, with one hand around a mug and the other smoothing his tie, and people would give those small, uncomfortable laughs people give when they do not want to choose a side. Silas heard about the remarks now and then. He never answered them. On the same road, 2 houses down, Irene Holloway answered in quieter ways. She was 72, widowed, narrow-shouldered, and steadier than most people half her age. Her white hair was always pinned back with 2 dark clips. Her porch light came on before dusk every evening, and her garden had more stubbornness than beauty, though in May the peonies still rose like old queens refusing retirement. Irene did not ask Silas why another rescue van had stopped in front of his house. She did not ask why some dogs left after 3 weeks and others stayed for 2 months. She did not ask why he never kept one, even when a dog followed him from room to room, slept by his boots, or watched him with the kind of trust that made other people soften too quickly. She only helped where help fit. On rainy mornings, she left pumpkin bread wrapped in foil on his porch rail. When the temperature dropped, she set a paper bag of clean old towels beside his back gate with a note that said, "For muddy paws," though both of them knew the towels were also for small, frightened bodies that needed warmth. Once, after a storm blew half his mail into the ditch, Silas found the envelopes stacked under a soup can on his porch, dry as church paper. He never thanked her loudly. She never seemed to need that. Inside Silas's kitchen, everything had a place. The coffee tin sat beside the stove. The Foster paperwork went into a blue folder near the phone. Medications stayed in a locked cabinet above the sink, each bottle labeled in block letters. On the lower shelf of the pantry, folded blankets waited for the next dog who might arrive smelling of shelter disinfectant, rainwater, old fear, or all three. Only one thing in the house had no real place, and that was why it stayed hidden. In the bottom drawer beside the stove, beneath spare batteries, worn work gloves, and a coil of paracord, Silas kept an old leather collar. The nameplate was scratched from years of sand, rain, and hard use, Bishop. The letters were still readable if the light caught them right. Silas did not take it out often. Sometimes, late at night, when the house had gone still and no foster dog needed water, medicine, or a patient hand near the crate, he would open that drawer and rest his fingers on the leather without lifting it. His thumb always found the same worn place near the buckle. His breathing would change for a few seconds, barely enough for another person to notice, and then he would close the drawer again. Bishop had been more than a working dog, though Silas would never have said that in front of anyone who liked clean categories. Bishop had known the weight of Silas's hand, the rhythm of his steps, the difference between command and fear. In places where the night had teeth and every sound mattered, Bishop had moved beside him like a second heartbeat. Then one day Silas had come home with both hands empty. The story lived in him after that, but not as words. It lived in the way he checked locks twice. It lived in the way he never raised his voice at a frightened dog. It lived in the way he could stand in a room full of people and still look as if he were listening for something far away. 5 years after leaving the Navy, Silas began fostering dogs for the local rescue because it gave his days a shape without asking him to explain himself. Marla Vance, who ran the shelter, learned quickly that Silas did not need long instructions. She brought him the dogs who needed patience, structure, quiet rooms, and someone who would not mistake fear for bad behavior. He was good at that. He took in dogs who trembled under tables, dogs who guarded empty bowls, dogs who paced when thunder rolled through the valley, dogs who had forgotten that a hand could mean food instead of trouble. He fed them on schedule, taught them doors were not traps, helped them sleep through ordinary house sounds, and sent notes back to the shelter, written in careful, practical detail. Likes soft blankets, startles at dropped pans, responds better to low voice, needs a family that will wait. Then, when the right people came, Silas let the dogs go. He stood in doorways while new owners lifted crates into cars. He handed over folders, leashes, favorite toys, and advice he had earned one quiet morning at a time. He watched taillights disappear down Quarry Road, then went back inside to wash the bowls, fold the blankets, and make the house ready for the next life that needed passing through. People called it kindness. Silas knew it was partly that. But beneath the kindness was a rule he had built around the place in himself that still hurt. He could rescue them, steady them, teach them how to trust a home, and hand them to someone better suited to keep them. He could be the bridge between fear and belonging, as long as he never mistook himself for the destination. That was the rule. Heal them, train them, let them go. And for 5 years Silas Keene lived as if obeying it could make an old loss easier to carry. Before the 38th dog, there had been 37. Silas did not keep photographs of all of them on the wall because that would have made the house feel too much like a place of ghosts. He kept records instead. Clean notes in blue folders, vaccination dates, feeding habits, fear triggers, walking patterns, small preferences that most people missed until a dog had already misunderstood the world twice. To Silas, those details mattered more than sentimental memory, or at least that was what he told himself when the house went quiet after another adoption. The first one he remembered without trying was Waffles. Waffles was an old beagle with a round belly, soft brown ears, and eyes that always looked as if someone had promised him breakfast and then betrayed him personally. He arrived on a cool September morning with stiff hips, a suspicious relationship with stairs, and a talent for creating mild household mysteries. By the end of his second week, Silas had found one wool sock under the couch, two dish towels inside the dog bed, and an electric bill buried halfway beneath the front porch planter. It was hard not to respect the effort. Waffles moved through the house like a retired mayor inspecting public property. He snuffled under cabinets, sighed at closed doors, and stared at Silas's dinner with the wounded dignity of a man denied his constitutional rights. The first time Silas laughed because of him, he was standing in the kitchen at 6:20 in the morning, holding a missing sock that had been carefully placed in Waffles' empty food bowl. The laugh came out rough and startled, as if it had been stored too long in a room without windows. Irene Holloway heard it from her porch. She did not mention it later. She only left a small bag of homemade dog biscuits near his gate with a note that said, "For the gentleman thief." Silas read the note twice, put it in the kitchen drawer above Bishop's collar, then pretended he had not done anything sentimental. Waffles found his person in Mrs. Alma Sutter, a retired librarian who lived near the old Lutheran church. She came to meet him in a pale blue cardigan, with soft shoes and a canvas bag full of library returns, because Alma never liked going anywhere without a book nearby. She did not squeal when she saw him. She did not clap her hands or call him baby. She simply lowered herself into Silas's old armchair, patted her knee once, and waited. Waffles considered her for almost a full minute. Then he walked over, rested his gray muzzle on the top of her shoe, and released one long, tired breath. Alma looked down at him, and her face changed in a way Silas understood better than he wanted to. She had not come looking for a project. She had come looking for company that knew how to be quiet. Silas signed the adoption papers that afternoon. He gave Alma the feeding notes, the joint supplement schedule, and a warning that Waffles might attempt financial sabotage if left alone with mail. Alma laughed, tucked the folder into her canvas bag, and promised to keep important documents above beagle height. When her car pulled away, Waffles stood on the back seat and watched the road ahead, not the house behind him. Silas washed the bowl before dinner. The next dog that stayed with him in a different way was Juniper. She was a border collie mix with a narrow face, black and white fur, and the careful movements of an animal who had learned that the world could change without warning. A dropped spoon sent her under the table. A door closing too fast made her body flatten against the floor. Even the sound of kibble hitting a metal bowl could turn her eyes wide and distant. Silas did not try to fix her all at once. He put down rugs so her paws would not slip. He changed the metal bowl for a heavy ceramic one. He stopped walking straight toward her and learned to move around the room in wide, patient arcs, as if the air between them belonged partly to her. Most evenings, he sat on the kitchen floor with his back against the cabinet, repairing leashes or reading old manuals while Juniper watched from the hallway. For 9 nights she did not come closer. On the 10th she stepped onto the edge of the rug, placed one paw down, then took it back as if testing the honesty of the house. Silas kept his eyes on the leash in his hands. Rain tapped against the back window, the refrigerator hummed, and Juniper stood there deciding whether a man could be trusted if he did not demand anything from her. By the end of the month, she could sleep through the sound of a cabinet closing. That felt like a victory large enough to keep private. Nora and Wade Bell came from an apple farm outside town, where the mornings smelled of damp leaves and old crates. Wade had big hands and knew enough to keep them still. Nora sat down on Silas's living room floor without making herself important, one knee bent, one palm resting loosely on her leg, her face turned slightly away from Juniper. Juniper watched her from beside the bookcase. No one spoke for a while. The old clock clicked. A truck passed somewhere beyond the road, low and distant. Then Juniper walked forward, not bravely, not dramatically, just one careful step after another, until her nose touched Nora's sleeve. Silas looked toward the window. Some goodbyes were clean because they were right. Some were painful for the same reason. When Juniper followed Nora out to the truck without looking back, Silas felt something in his chest loosen and ache at the same time, like a knot pulled free from an old rope. The third was Mac, who made seriousness impossible. Mac was a black Labrador with a broad head, bright eyes, and a tail that seemed powered by a separate engine. He had been surrendered by a family that loved him but could not handle his size, his joy, or his deep belief that every stranger had been placed on earth to admire him. Marla warned Silas that Mac needed structure. Mac heard the word structure and rolled onto his back. For 3 weeks, Silas tried to teach him not to greet visitors like a parade float with paws. Mac learned sit, stay, and down with excellent speed, then used all three commands as a strategy to earn belly rubs. If Silas told him to sit, Mac sat. If Silas told him to stay, Mac stayed for nearly 4 seconds. If Silas told him down, Mac flopped onto his back with all 4 feet in the air and a face full of spiritual conviction. Even Preston Vale could not ruin Mac's mood. One afternoon, Preston passed Silas outside the hardware store and glanced at the Labrador sitting beside him. "That one of your troubled cases?" he asked, smooth as butter on cold toast. Before Silas could answer, Mac leaned his entire body against Preston's polished trousers and wagged hard enough to dust both shoes with Labrador hair. Preston stepped back, offended and helpless, while Irene, who had been buying potting soil nearby, turned her face toward a display of seed packets and very clearly did not laugh. Deputy Clay Romer adopted Mac after arriving at the rescue in uniform, saying he wanted a calm, steady dog with discipline. Mac greeted him by sitting beautifully, holding eye contact, and then collapsing belly up across Clay's boots. Clay stared down for a moment as if reconsidering several life decisions. Then he laughed so hard Marla had to wipe her eyes. "Maybe I'm the one who needs training," Clay said. Silas knew then that Mac was gone. Not lost, placed, chosen, sent where his ridiculous joy would not be corrected out of him. When Clay drove away with Mac's head out the cracked window and his tongue fluttering in the spring air, Silas stood by the rescue entrance with an empty leash in his hand and felt that familiar sadness settle into its proper place. Waffles had needed gentleness that could laugh. Juniper had needed patience that did not reach too fast. Mac had needed a man serious enough to be softened. Each one had taught Silas something, and each one had confirmed what 5 years of fostering had slowly built inside him. He believed he could read the moment when a dog was ready to leave. He believed that if the right home opened, his job was to step back before his heart confused need with love. He believed that a clean handoff, a full folder, and a quiet drive home were signs that he had done the work correctly. He believed this because 37 dogs had made it seem true. For a while, that belief held. Then, on a damp Monday morning while Silas was folding a clean blanket beside the dryer, his phone rang on the kitchen counter. Marla's name lit the screen, and outside the window a thin rain was beginning to silver the fence rails. Silas wiped his hands on a towel before answering, already expecting another frightened hound, another stiff old terrier, another dog who needed a bridge. Marla did not start with paperwork. She started with a sigh. "Silas," she said, "we just got a German Shepherd puppy in." Marla let the words sit on the line for a moment, as if she knew the breed alone would reach a room in Silas that most people never entered. The rain outside had turned the fence rails silver, and the blanket in Silas's hands suddenly felt heavier than it should have. He looked toward the bottom kitchen drawer without meaning to, then looked away before the old habit could become a memory. "A shepherd puppy?" he asked. "About 7 weeks," Marla said, small but alert. A produce vendor found him near the back lot after the farmer's market opened. "No collar, no chip. He is warm now, eating fine, and already acting like he has opinions about management." Silas almost smiled. That should have made the call easier. He had handled German shepherds in war zones, training yards, airports, recovery kennels, and rescue homes where the floors creaked and the dogs watched every hand that moved. He knew the breed's intelligence could look like stubbornness, and its fear could dress itself up as pride. Still, the word shepherd carried Bishop's shadow into the kitchen, quiet as weather. For a few seconds, Silas said nothing. Then he reached for his keys. The drive to the shelter took him past wet fields, a gas station with 2 trucks idling under the awning, and the square where Preston Vale's insurance office sat with its clean windows and little brass bell. The rain was light enough for people to keep walking without umbrellas, but steady enough to darken shoulders and gather in the seams of old brick sidewalks. By the time Silas pulled into the rescue lot, his windshield wipers had found a tired rhythm that matched the morning. Bluffside Animal Rescue sat in a low building that had once been a farm supply store. The sign out front leaned slightly after every winter, no matter how many times Marla sent someone out with a ladder and a socket wrench. Inside, the air smelled of clean towels, dry kibble, disinfectant, and the faint nervous energy of animals waiting for the next door to open. Marla met him near the intake room with a clipboard against her chest. She was in her mid-40s, practical in the way shelter people became practical when feelings had to share space with budgets, paperwork, and too many full kennels. Her hair was pulled back, her sweatshirt had a faded rescue logo, and one sleeve was dusted with puppy kibble. She looked at Silas for half a second longer than usual. "You can say no," she said. He knew she meant more than the puppy. "I came to look," Silas said. "Of course you did." The puppy was in the small intake pen, standing with all four paws planted wide on a fleece towel as if defending a tiny kingdom. Black and tan fur framed a narrow face still too young for its own seriousness. One ear had started to lift. The other folded sideways in a soft, uncertain triangle. His paws looked too big, his tail too determined, and his brown eyes followed Silas with the hard little focus of an animal measuring the room. "He was found behind the produce stalls," Marla said quietly. "The vendor said he was tucked near some empty crates. No drama. Just cold from the rain and hungry enough to forgive us for breakfast." The puppy looked at Marla when she said breakfast. Then he looked back at Silas. Silas crouched beside the pen and waited. He did not reach in right away. He let the puppy hear his breathing, smell the rain on his jacket, study the worn leather of his boots. Most frightened dogs watched hands first, but this one watched everything at once, as if the whole world had already been disappointing, and he intended to keep records. "Hey, little man," Silas said. The puppy did not blink. Marla leaned against the doorframe. "He has already rejected 2 blankets, 1 chew toy, and my assistant's attempt at baby talk. Ethan said he has the personality of a drill instructor trapped in a stuffed animal." Silas lowered his hand, palm down, slow and loose. The puppy walked forward. For one strange second, Silas expected the small nose to touch his fingers, expected the tiny body to soften, expected the familiar first thread of trust. Instead, the puppy stepped neatly over his hand, inspected his left boot, and clamped his little teeth around the lace with grave professional commitment. Marla pressed her lips together. Silas looked down. "That is government property," he said. The puppy tugged once. Not hard. Not scared. Just certain. Marla lost the fight and laughed. Silas should have laughed too, but the sound caught somewhere behind his ribs. The puppy's brow, the bright suspicion in his eyes, the ridiculous seriousness of that grip on the bootlace, all of it brushed against a door inside him that had stayed shut for years. Bishop had once stolen a glove from a Navy medic and carried it through camp as if it were classified material. Silas gently freed the lace. The puppy sat back and looked offended. "What is his name?" Silas asked. "No official one yet." The vendor called him Buddy, but every third dog who comes through here gets called Buddy by someone. Silas studied the puppy. The small shepherd stared back with one ear up and one ear down, holding himself with more dignity than his body had earned. A name rose in Silas's mind, plain and stubborn like a boot track in wet ground. "Bodie," he said. The puppy sneezed. Marla lifted an eyebrow. Strong reaction, could be approval, could be an insult. Either way, he answered. By late afternoon, Bodie was in a small travel crate on the passenger side of Silas's truck, chewing the corner of the towel Marla had sent with him. The rain had thinned into mist, and the sky over Quarry Road had opened just enough for a pale bar of light to rest along the ditch grass. Silas drove slower than he needed to, partly because of the wet road, and partly because the crate beside him made the cab feel too full of things he had not agreed to feel. Bodie did not whine. He did not sleep either. He watched the road through the crate door with fierce concentration, then turned his head whenever Silas shifted in the seat. Twice, Silas felt those brown eyes on him and kept both hands on the wheel. It was only a Foster ride. A few weeks of feeding, rest, structure, and early manners. Then an application, a family, a folder, a clean goodbye. That was how the world stayed manageable. When Silas pulled into his drive, Preston Vale was standing by his mailbox across the road, holding a glossy flyer for the spring fair. His coat looked too neat for the weather, and his smile arrived before his warmth did. He waited until Silas lifted the crate from the truck before speaking. "Another one, keen?" Silas closed the truck door with his hip. Afternoon, Preston. Preston glanced at the crate, then at the towels on the line, then at the fence Silas had repaired after the winter thaw. You know, some folks around here like a quiet road. Rescue work is admirable, of course, when it stays under control. Bodie stopped chewing the towel. The puppy raised his head, looked at Preston for one exact second, and sneezed against the crate door. Silas looked down at him. Preston frowned, unsure whether he had been judged. "I will keep that in mind," Silas said. He carried Bodie inside before the conversation could grow legs. The kitchen was warm, the ceramic bowl was ready, and a small bed sat near the stove where the floor held heat longest. Silas opened the crate and stepped back, giving Bodie room to come out on his own. Bodie walked past the bed. He inspected the water bowl, barked once at the coffee maker, grabbed the corner of a dish towel and dragged it under the table with the pride of a conqueror claiming a flat. Then he marched to the mudroom, climbed into the old boot bin, turned in 2 uneven circles, and sat down on top of Silas's work gloves. Silas stood in the kitchen doorway. "Comfortable?" Bodie stared at him. The next few days confirmed the puppy had little interest in being easy. He ate well, slept in short bursts, and learned the back step faster than expected, but he treated every object in the house as a question that needed teeth. The coffee maker remained his sworn enemy. The soft bed by the stove remained beneath his standards. The boot bin became his chosen headquarters, though he sometimes abandoned it for the narrow patch of floor beside the sink where Bishop used to lie when Silas cooked. Silas noticed. He told himself not to. On the third night, wind shifted hard out of the north and pressed rain against the kitchen windows. Bodie had finally worn himself out after a long battle with a rubber chew shaped like a duck. Silas sat on the floor near the stove, one knee raised, a mug of cold coffee beside him, watching the puppy pretend not to watch him back. The house was quiet enough for old memories to move around. Silas did not know why he spoke. Maybe because Bodie was a shepherd. Maybe because the rain sounded like the kind Bishop used to hate, soft and endless, the kind that made him give Silas a betrayed look before stepping outside anyway. Maybe because a small dog with one uncertain ear had spent 3 days acting as if Silas were staff, and somehow that made the room feel safer. Bishop hated rain like this, Silas said. Bodie blinked. He would cross a creek without thinking, mud, water, brush, whatever got in his way. But this little misty stuff. Silas looked toward the window, his thumb moving over the handle of the mug. He acted like I had personally arranged it to ruin his evening. Bodie yawned. Silas huffed once, almost a laugh. He stole a medic's glove once, carried it around half the morning, would not give it back until the man traded him a biscuit and apologized with respect. Bodie turned his head away. Silas looked at the small back, the folded ear, the stubborn line of the puppy's shoulders. A man could tell a story to a dog and still feel foolish when the dog refused to dignify it. He reached over, set his mug on the floor, and pushed himself up slowly. "Right," he said. "None of your business." He went to the sink, rinsed the cup, and stood there a moment longer than he needed to. Behind him, there was no sound except rain, the hum of the refrigerator, and the faint shift of a puppy settling into the floorboards. When Silas turned out the kitchen light and walked toward the hall, Bodie did not follow. But in the dark, after Silas had taken 3 steps away, the puppy opened his eyes and watched him go. By the time Bodie had been in Silas's house long enough to learn which floorboards creaked, the shelter's inbox had begun filling faster than Marla liked. A German Shepherd puppy had a way of making reasonable adults forget that cuteness came with teeth, noise, vet bills, patience, and years of responsibility. Marla answered every inquiry with the same careful tone, reminding people that a puppy was not a spring decoration. Bodie made the job harder by looking innocent in photographs. In the best picture, he sat on Silas's porch with one ear halfway up, one ear still folded, and a face so serious it looked almost borrowed from an older dog. The morning sun caught the brown in his eyes, the wet grass shone behind him, and the blue collar had sent home made him look smaller than he wanted to admit. Silas took 12 photos before Bodie stopped chewing the leash long enough to be presentable. The post went up at 8:40 on a Thursday morning. By noon, 11 families had asked about him. Silas watched Marla sort through applications at the shelter office. That afternoon, Bodie asleep under his chair with one paw resting on the toe of his boot. He told himself that was convenience, not attachment. A dog liked warmth, leather, and familiar smell. A foster home was full of familiar smells by design. That was all. The first family Marla chose was Calvin and Beth Monroe, a couple in their 40s who lived near College Drive in a white house with clean gutters, a fenced yard, and a back porch wide enough for a dog to grow into. Calvin worked for the community college maintenance department, and Beth ran payroll for a clinic outside town. They had lost an older shepherd mix the year before and had waited, carefully and deliberately, before applying for another dog. Their house seemed ready before Bodhi even stepped inside. There was a new bed near the living room window with his name stitched in blue thread, a basket of chew toys sorted by size, a puppy gate across the hallway, and a feeding chart written in colored marker on the refrigerator. Beth knelt without reaching too fast. Calvin opened the crate and sat back on his heels, giving Bodhi room to decide. Bodhi stepped out, sniffed the floor, and walked straight past the new bed. Beth smiled anyway. "He will find his spot," she said. Silas wanted to believe her. The Monroes were kind without being foolish, prepared without being careless, and gentle in the quiet way that usually mattered more than enthusiasm. When Bodhi paused by the glass back door and looked out at the fenced yard, Silas felt the old mechanism inside him begin to work. Assess, approve, release. He handed Calvin the folder with feeding notes, sleep habits, and the warning about shoelaces. He told Beth the coffee maker seemed to offend Bodhi on a personal level. Beth laughed. Calvin promised to double-check every latch, and Bodhi sat between them with his folded ear drooping sideways, looking like a small judge who had not yet reached a verdict. Silas drove home alone. For the first few days, the photos helped. Bodhi beside the water bowl, Bodhi looking at the toy basket. Bodhi asleep near the new bed, though never quite inside it. Beth's messages were warm, careful, a little anxious in the way good adopters often were when they wanted to do everything right. Still, something in the pictures made Silas look twice. Bodhi was calm, but calm was not always peace. He was eating, sleeping, going outside, letting Beth stroke his head, and watching Calvin move through the kitchen without fear. Yet every photo showed him angled toward a door or window, his attention placed somewhere beyond the frame, as if he were listening for a sound the Monroes had not been told to make. Silas told himself not to invent problems. For several days he almost succeeded. Then Beth called before breakfast, her voice thin with panic. Bodhi had slipped out through the back door when Calvin stepped onto the porch with a bag of trash. It had taken seconds. One moment he was in the kitchen. The next he was through the opening and across the wet grass. Silas listened without interrupting. Marla sent out the alert. Calvin searched the neighborhood. Beth walked block after block with treats in her coat pocket and guilt in every word she left on Silas's phone. By late afternoon, a jogger reported seeing a small shepherd puppy near the edge of Quarry Road, close enough to Silas's house that Marla stopped speaking for a moment after she checked the map. Silas found Bodhi near a ditch where spring weeds had started pushing through the mud. The puppy was damp, lightly dirty, and hungry enough to accept the small treat Silas held out, but his eyes were clear and his steps steady. A passing truck made him flinch closer to the grass, and Silas crouched low until the road went quiet again. "Come here, little man," Silas said. Bodhi came close, sniffed his hand, then bent down and took the left bootlace in his teeth. Silas closed his eyes for 1 second. Of course, the Monroes were relieved enough to cry. Beth held Bodhi against her sweater, apologizing to him, to Silas, to Marla, to anyone who would listen. Calvin added a second latch to the back door, tightened the gate, and moved the trash bin farther from the porch. They wanted to try again, and Silas could not say they were wrong. The story reached town before Silas wanted it to. At the grocery store, one woman said puppies followed old scent trails. Another said the Monroes must have missed something. Preston Vale, seated near the front window with his coffee, placed his mug down and said this was exactly why rescue work required emotional discipline and proper boundaries. He made it sound less like concern and more like a verdict. Irene Holloway stood by the bread rack, holding a loaf of rye. "Sometimes," she said mildly, "an animal knows the way home before people understand what home means." Preston blinked at her. Irene paid for her bread. The second try lasted only a short while. The Monroes became more careful, then too careful, moving through their own home as if Bodhi were made of glass in consequence. They watched doors, checked cameras, praised every small success, and loved him with a tenderness that should have been enough. Bodhi did not punish them for it. He did not chew the furniture, growl, or hide. He simply never settled. One wet evening, after a grocery delivery left the side gate ajar for less than a minute, Bodhi slipped out again. Beth called Silas from the driveway, crying softly enough that he had to step onto his porch to hear her over the rain. Before midnight, Bodhi was sitting on Silas's welcome mat, damp around the ears, looking mildly inconvenienced by the weather and entirely certain about the address. Beth returned him to the shelter the next morning. "We love him," she told Marla, her eyes red, "but he is waiting for something we do not have." The second home was Harold Tully's, 6 miles out past old corn cribs, low fields, and a stretch of road where the wind moved freely enough to make fence wire hum. Harold was a retired school bus mechanic with heavy hands, a slow voice, and a house that smelled of wood oil, black coffee, and old work jackets. He had raised dogs all his life and did not believe in fussing over them until they forgot how to be dogs. Silas respected that. Harold had no embroidered bed, no camera, no color-coded feeding chart. He had a plain blanket near the stove, a fenced side yard, a bowl heavy enough not to tip, and the patience of a man who understood that trust could not be pulled out of an animal like a splinter. Bodhi entered the house, sniffed the threshold, and looked back at Silas. Silas ignored the look. He had been trusted by 37 goodbyes. Harold sent fewer updates than Beth, but the ones he sent were honest. Bodhi slept, mostly by the front door. Bodhi followed Harold from room to room, then stopped near the hallway as if some invisible line had been drawn there. He was not afraid of Harold. That made it worse. On the 8th night, Harold called Marla. Bodhi had slipped through the mudroom door when a gust of wind caught it wrong. Harold's voice shook with frustration, not blame, and Silas could hear the old man's truck already running in the background when Marla called him. The search stretched across days that changed weather too often to feel merciful. Morning mist gave way to bright wind. Bright wind fell into rain, and rain left the roads shining under porch lights where Silas knocked with Bodhi's photo in his hand. Marla posted updates. Harold drove the same loops until his truck tires carried half the county on them. Irene left a thermos of coffee on Silas's porch every evening and never rang the bell. By the 7th night, people had started lowering their voices when they said Bodhi's name. Silas hated that most. The house felt wrong without the small arguments Bodhi made against everything in it. The coffee maker sat unchallenged. The boot bin stayed neat. The soft bed by the stove looked less like bedding and more like an accusation. Silas had just turned off the kitchen light when he heard it. A faint scratch at the front door. He stood still, afraid to move too quickly and break whatever had reached him through the dark. The sound came again, small and deliberate. Silas crossed the room, opened the door, and felt the cold night air fold around his legs. Bodhi sat on the welcome mat. His paws carried dust and damp grass, and his fur held the smell of fields and rain, but he was upright, alert, and looking directly at Silas. He did not bark. He did not leap. He only lifted one small paw and placed it on Silas's boot, as if the man had finally arrived where the puppy had been trying to bring him all along. Silas did not sleep much after Bodhi came back. The puppy spent the rest of that night in the warmest corner of the kitchen, wrapped in an old towel Irene had left on the porch 2 days earlier. He drank a little water, ate from Silas's hand in small, careful bites, and then curled into himself with the solemn exhaustion of a creature who had done something far larger than his own body understood. Every few minutes, Silas looked over from the table to make sure the small rise and fall of Bodhi's ribs stayed steady. The house had been quiet many times before. This quiet felt different. At 7:15 the next morning, Silas carried Bodhi into Dr. Helen Carver's clinic, a narrow brick building beside the feed store with geraniums in the front window and a brass bell that sounded softer than it looked. The waiting room smelled faintly of clean towels, coffee, and antiseptic, and somewhere behind the exam room door, a dryer hummed with blankets fresh from the laundry. Bodhi rested against Silas's chest, awake but calm, one ear folded against the sleeve of his jacket. Dr. Carver had been treating rescue animals in Winneshiek County for nearly 30 years, long enough to know when people were exaggerating and when they were trying very hard not to. She was a compact woman in her late 50s, with silver-brown hair, reading glasses on a chain, and the kind of steady hands that made even anxious dogs reconsider their opinions. She listened as Silas explained where Harold lived, how long Bodhi had been missing, and how the puppy had turned up at his front door after dark. She did not interrupt. That worried him more than questions would have. Bodhi handled the exam better than Silas expected. He disliked the thermometer, tolerated the stethoscope, and gave Dr. Carver one offended look when she checked his paws. There were a few small scrapes, some stiffness, and the kind of tiredness that required warmth, meals, water, and sleep more than drama. Nothing was broken. Nothing pointed toward serious harm. Silas let out a breath he had been holding since the night before. Dr. Carver removed her glasses and looked at Bodhi for a long moment. He needs rest, small meals, and quiet. Keep him warm. Watch him for a couple of days. But physically, he is doing better than I would have expected. Silas nodded. Good, that is not the strange part. He looked up. With a puppy this young, 6 miles is a great deal of world, she said. Dogs can follow scent, routine, sound, even the memory of where they felt safe. We know that. But this is still unusual. She reached down and let Bodhi sniff the back of her fingers. Whatever he found at your house, he made a decision about it. Silas looked at the puppy. Bodhi looked back, then yawned into his sleeve. By late morning, Silas brought him home under a sky that could not decide between rain and sunlight. The road shone in patches, mailboxes dripped along the ditches, and the hills beyond town wore thin veils of mist that lifted and returned as the wind changed. Bodhi slept through most of the drive, his nose tucked into the towel, his body finally soft in a way it had never been at the Monroses' house or Harold's. At home, Silas placed him in the soft bed near the stove. For the first time, Bodhi stayed there. He did not climb into the boot bin. He did not drag a dish towel across the floor. He did not glare at the coffee maker, though his ears twitched when it clicked. He only turned twice, pressed his chin into the folded blanket, and fell asleep as if he had been holding himself upright for days. Silas stood over him longer than necessary. Then a knock came at the back door. Irene Holloway stood on the porch with a covered bowl, in both hands, her gray sweater buttoned wrong at the top, and her shoes dark from wet grass. She looked past Silas through the kitchen window and saw Bodhi asleep by the stove. Her expression did not brighten in surprise. It softened as if something she had suspected had simply arrived on time. "Chicken soup," she said, "for you, not him." Silas took the bowl. "Thank you. I figured you would forget lunch and call it discipline." He almost smiled. "I have done that. I know." She did not come in, though he stepped aside without thinking. Instead, she stayed beneath the porch roof, where rain tapped lightly on the gutter, and the smell of warming soup rose between them. Her eyes returned to Bodhi, small and still in the bed he had once refused. "He looks different," she said. "Tired." "No." Irene shook her head. Finished arguing, Silas looked back into the kitchen. Bodhi slept with one paw hanging over the edge of the bed, his folded ear resting against the blanket Irene had brought days earlier. It should have been an ordinary sight. A puppy sleeping in a warm room, a bowl of soup, rain on the porch. It made Silas feel cornered. "I can't keep him," he said. Irene looked at him, not sharply, not softly, but with the plainness of someone too old to decorate the truth. "You keep saying that as if the decision still belongs only to you." He said nothing. "Some houses are places we lend," she continued. "Some are places someone small claims before we have the courage to call them home." The words stayed after she left. For the next 3 nights, Silas moved through the house as if the floor had changed under him. Bodhi recovered quickly, eating well, sleeping hard, and returning to his war with the coffee maker by the second morning. He chewed the corner of one old glove, barked at a broom leaning in the mudroom, and fell asleep each afternoon with his chin touching Silas's left boot. Silas tried not to understand that. On the 4th night, after Bodhi had finally settled near the stove, Silas opened the bottom drawer beside the sink. Bishop's collar lay beneath the work gloves and the coil of paracord, exactly where it had waited for years. He lifted it out, carried it to the table, and wiped the dusty nameplate with his thumb until the letters caught the light. Bishop. Silas did not speak the whole story aloud, not to Bodhi, not to the empty kitchen, not even to himself. But in the small scrape of his thumb over worn leather was the shape of everything he had not forgiven. The last command, the last silence, the plane ride home, the empty space beside his boots. He had turned fostering into a noble thing. He had also turned it into a punishment. By morning, the rain was gone. Silas drove to Bluffside Animal Rescue, with Bodhi sitting in a crate beside him, quieter than usual, one paw pressed against the wire door. Marla looked up from the front desk when he walked in, and whatever she had been about to say disappeared when she saw the puppy tucked against his arm. Bodhi's head rested beneath Silas's chin. Marla opened the filing cabinet without asking. The adoption form looked exactly like the others Silas had handed to 37 families over 5 years. Same boxes, same lines, same plain language for a decision that did not feel plain at all. For the first time, Silas wrote his own name in the owner field. His hand did not shake. Not until afterward. Bodhi did not leave after that. He remained stubborn, suspicious of appliances, and convinced shoelaces were a form of personal correspondence. But he stopped watching the door as if waiting for the next mistake. He slept in the bed by the stove, followed Silas into the yard, and learned that Irene's porch meant biscuits if he sat politely enough to look accidental. The town did not change with the signing of one paper. Preston Vale still made remarks at meetings about order, stability, and the importance of choosing volunteers who could work smoothly with the public. He did not say Silas's name. He did not have to. But a few people no longer laughed as easily, and when Irene sat in the second row with her hands folded over her purse, Preston's smile tightened by a barely visible inch. Something had shifted. Then came the fundraiser at Bluffside Community Hall. The fundraiser came on the last Saturday of April, after a morning rain had rinsed the streets clean and left the whole town smelling of wet grass, warm asphalt, and lilacs opening too early along fence lines. By 3 o'clock, sunlight had returned in slanted pieces, catching on puddles near the curb and turning the windows of Bluffside Community Hall gold. Inside, the old wood floor carried the scent of coffee, baked bread, cardboard boxes, and the faint dust of a building that had hosted too many potlucks to ever feel empty. Marla had worried no one would come, then everyone came. By the front windows, volunteers arranged donated leashes, collars, old dog crates, and stacks of folded blankets. Near the kitchen, Irene Holloway stood behind a table of pies and pumpkin bread, with Bodhi sitting politely at her feet for exactly 12 seconds at a time. Silas stayed near the back wall, one hand resting lightly on Bodhi's blue leash, watching the room fill with people who had once known him mostly by rumor. Bodhi had grown steadier since the adoption, though not exactly humble. One ear still folded when he was tired, his paws still looked a size ahead of his body, and he remained deeply suspicious of anything with a motor. He accepted attention from strangers with the reserved dignity of a small official inspecting a parade. Silas found that almost comforting. Across the hall, Preston Vale moved through the crowd as if the fundraiser had been waiting for him to give it shape. He shook hands, complimented pies, reminded people where to place checks, and adjusted the donation jar so its label faced outward. His coat was dark, his shoes were polished, and his smile made each conversation look slightly photographed. At 3:40, Preston stepped near the microphone. A few people quieted out of habit. He began with thanks to the volunteers, praise for Marla's work, and several polished sentences about responsibility. His voice carried easily over the folding chairs and coffee urns, rich and practiced, rising whenever he said words like community, service, and trust. He spoke about people who showed up when town life required more than good intentions. He did not look at Silas. Several people did. Silas lowered his eyes and adjusted Bodhi's leash near the clasp. He had no wish to become part of Preston's performance, especially not in a room that smelled of sugar, damp coats, and old judgment. Bodhi stood beside him, nose lifted, attention shifting from the pie table to the kitchen door. Then the puppy went still. At first, Silas thought Bodhi had spotted a crumb or heard someone open a food container. The hall was noisy enough for ordinary things to hide inside it. Chair legs scraping, cups clinking, children laughing near the blanket table, Preston's voice wrapping itself around another careful phrase. But Bodhi was no longer interested in any of that. He backed half a step from the kitchen doorway. A low whine slipped from his throat. Silas crouched beside him. "What is it?" Bodhi lifted one paw and scratched at Silas's boot once, then again. His nose angled toward the kitchen, but his body leaned away from it. Silas followed the line of that small body, pulled in a slow breath through his nose, and caught something thin beneath the coffee and baked ham. Gas. The room had been moving toward one kind of afternoon. In the space of one breath, it became another. Silas stood and placed Bodhi's leash into Irene's hand. Take him outside, front lawn. Keep him away from the building. Irene did not ask why. She looked at his face, then at Bodhi, and her fingers closed around the leash with steady care. Come on, young man, she murmured, guiding the puppy toward the front door as if they were only stepping out for fresh air. Silas moved to Marla next. Open the main doors, he said quietly. Ask everyone to step outside. No light switches. No kitchen appliances. Keep it calm. Marla's face changed, but her voice did not break when she turned to the nearest volunteers. Silas crossed toward the kitchen entrance, close enough to confirm the smell, far enough to keep himself from doing anything foolish for the sake of looking brave. He raised one hand, and the room began to notice him. Preston stopped speaking. There may be a gas leak near the kitchen, Silas said, his voice even. Everyone step outside slowly. Leave the back hall clear. Do not touch the switches. We are going to let the fire department check it. For half a second, no one moved. Then Preston laughed once, too bright and too small. I am sure the puppy simply found the sausage tray interesting. Let's not alarm people over a dog's nose. A woman near the coffee urn frowned. I smell something too. That ended the speech better than applause ever could have. Preston's smile loosened. He took one step back, then another, glancing toward the kitchen as if responsibility had suddenly become a very hot dish someone else had brought. I will coordinate from outside, he announced, turning toward the door with impressive speed. His polished shoe caught the edge of the donation box. Coins rattled across the floor. No one laughed loudly because fear still had a hand on the room, but several faces changed in a way they would remember later. Irene, already outside with Bodhi, watched through the open doorway as Preston gathered himself on the lawn and began pointing at nothing in particular. Silas waited until the crowd was moving, then went out the side exit and around to the rear service area. The gas shutoff was outside near the kitchen wall, half hidden behind a stack of empty milk crates. He checked the air, kept his movement slow, turned the valve off, and stepped back before calling 911 from the parking lot. He did only what needed doing. That was enough. The fire department arrived in under 10 minutes, though it felt longer to the people standing on the lawn with paper plates in their hands and worry cooling their coffee. Bodhi sat beside Irene, ears uneven, eyes fixed on Silas whenever he crossed the pavement. Preston stood near the flagpole, telling two older men that he had been about to recommend evacuation himself. Neither man answered quickly. The firefighters found the problem behind the kitchen range, an aging connector with a small leak, worsened when a volunteer had moved the stove that morning to sweep behind it. It was not dramatic. It was not a disaster. It was exactly the kind of quiet danger that becomes serious only when people ignore small warnings. By sunset, the hall was closed for repairs. The fundraiser tables had been moved to the lawn, and Marla was crying into a napkin because donations had somehow doubled. People came by Bodhi first, then Silas, which seemed to suit them both. One woman thanked him for keeping everyone calm. A man from the hardware store offered to inspect the shelter's old supply shed. Deputy Romer arrived late, took one look at Prest's scuffed shoe, and said nothing with admirable restraint. The town did not transform in a single afternoon. It softened at the edges. Over the next weeks, Silas noticed small changes. A nod at the grocery store lasted longer. Someone left a bag of puppy food on his porch with no name attached. Two teenagers signed up to help Marla clean kennels on Saturdays, and a retired carpenter offered to repair the shelter's back fence if someone else brought coffee. Preston still spoke at meetings, but the room listened differently. When he used the phrase civic responsibility again, someone near the back asked, gently enough to pass as innocence, whether he meant inside the building or from the lawn. Preston smiled tightly. Irene looked down at her purse. Silas stopped fostering at home after Bodhi. That part of his life ended quietly, without ceremony or apology. But he began helping the rescue in larger ways, teaching volunteers how to read fear before it became panic, how to let a dog approach without crowding it, how adoption meant more than loving the idea of being needed. The shelter changed because of that, so did he. On warm evenings, Irene sat in the chair that had somehow become hers on Silas's porch. Bodhi sprawled between them with one paw over Silas's boot. The coffee maker still offended him every morning. Shoelaces remained under suspicion. The house at the end of Quarry Road no longer felt like a bridge people crossed on the way somewhere else. Silas had once believed he saved dogs by refusing to keep one. Bodhi had come back enough times to prove that some rescues work the other way around. I keep coming back to that little bed by the stove. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was ordinary. A folded blanket, a tired puppy, a man standing nearby with more feeling than he knew what to do with. Sometimes healing does not announce itself. It just stops pacing by the door. The events in this story come from fiction, but the heart of it feels familiar to me. There are people who give and give because receiving feels dangerous. There are animals who notice what no one says out loud. And there are small communities that sometimes need one quiet moment to realize they have been looking at someone the wrong way. Maybe grace is not always grand. Maybe sometimes God lets it arrive as soup on a porch, a leash handed to a neighbor, or a stubborn paw resting on an old boot. If you have ever been brought home by the love of an animal, a friend, a neighbor, or a simple act of kindness, share your story in the comments. I'd be honored to read it. And if these quiet, grounded stories mean something to you, please like and subscribe. Somewhere tonight, a light is still burning near a kitchen window.